Hi, it's Sherri from A Quilting Life, and today I'm stopping by to share with you how I make my bias binding. I love making patchwork pot holders and bags, and both of them often require a bias binding because of the curved edges. So today I'll walk you through the steps to make your own bias binding without any special kind of tool. Okay, the easiest way to make a bias binding is to begin with a square of fabric. Now, a lot of times if you're making a pattern, they will tell you how much yardage you need for your bias binding, or they will tell you how big of a square to cut. I actually don't like to work with squares that are too big. It just makes it too hard for me to get the ruler to cut it, but you're going to start out with a square and you're going to make a diagonal cut. Now, if you are working with a larger square, I will get two rulers and put them together so that I can get it accurate. But generally what I'll do, 18 inch, I can almost get my 24.5 inch ruler. So I will just start my cut, and then I'll kind of slide the ruler to the other end so that I know I'm going diagonal to diagonal. And I'm going to cut that in half. Now what you've done is you've created two triangles, and these edges right here have a bias to them. They stretch a little bit more than these edges that aren't on the bias. If you look and you kind of pull, it's much more difficult to stretch the outer edges than it is these inner bias edges. Now what you're going to do is you're going to sew these two triangles together so that you can create the piece that you need to make your bias binding. And what you're going to do is you're going to leave one right side up, and you're going to flip the other over. Okay, so I went like that. And I put this. So you're actually putting two edges without bias together. And you're going to kind of just make sure that the ends, that there's about 1/4 of an inch there and 1/4 of an inch here. And you're going to go sew this seam. And after you sew the seam, you will have the two bias edges opposite like that. So let me run over to the machine. I'm going to sew it, and I'm going to press it open, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, so I'm back from the sewing machine. I've sewn the seam and pressed it open. Just to go back and show you, this is how I had it. So the bias is here and the bias is here. I sewed them right sides together. I pressed that seam open. And now we're going to get ready to cut our strips. Now you have to be careful that you're not, after doing all this work to make a bias binding, that you're not cutting on the straight edge of the fabric, and I can tell you I've done that before. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you're cutting on the bias edges. So it kind of looks like a parallelogram, and what you're going to do is you're going to, and sometimes I'll even like stretch it, make sure that I feel that bias, so I know that I'm doing the right thing. But so now it depends on what size strip you need to make, and you can cut whatever width binding you need once you've sewn this together. And I'm making pot holders right now, and so I've been using 2 1/8 inch binding. Normally for quilts I do 2 1/4, or for mini quilts I do 2 inches. If I'm doing a bag and there's lots of bulk, sometimes I might do 2 1/2 inch binding, but it's generally 2 1/4 inch binding is what I'll do. So I'm just going to cut those strips, and I'm going to use my long ruler. And again, I'm just going to slide the ruler as needed. I kind of keep it tight against the edge of my cutting blade. Okay, so there's a strip, and I'm going to continue cutting all the way across this piece that I've created and cut I actually just did that at 2 1/4. I'll just keep cutting 2 1/4 then. And so you just keep going. Bias binding is good to have on hand. So if you're making a bag or a small project or pot holder, you can, I've even taken leftover pieces of bias binding and made scrappy bias binding for pot holders. So I know I will use this, as I have about 8 pot holders ready to go. Sometimes when you get to the end, you have a strip that's too small to use. That's fine, just throw it away. But now what you're going to do is you're going to join these strips that you've cut together. And you'll notice that they already each have a seam. And that, you know, is from that first seam that you sewed. Sometimes the seam is really close to the edge, and I'll kind of wait and try to have that be a piece of, and sometimes I'll just cut that off. But what you're going to do is you're going to sew these together, and I just lay them like this so that the diagonal cuts are going the same way, and then I flip them right sides together. And the same thing, you're going to have the little triangles extending about 1/4 of an inch on each side, and you're going to sew that seam. And then you'll just continue on and you'll sew another piece the same way. You're just going to sew that together. And when you're done, this is a piece that I've already sewn. You'll just have lots of little seams, and don't worry, sometimes they go a different direction. That doesn't matter. You will trim off the little edges so that your binding is flat. And then I always fold it in half and press it so it's ready to use. But seam, seam. Anyway, and you'll notice with this type of binding, it has just a little bit of stretch right there. It just has that stretch that you'll need to get it to go around your curved pieces. And that's really all there is to it. It's a little bit extra work other than cutting straight strips from straight of grain yardage, but this just gives you what you need. And also, just one more thing, I have friends who always use bias binding. They feel like it's more sturdy on the edges of a quilt, and that it is stronger because of the way that the grain is cut. And so I do have friends that use bias binding on all of their quilts. So it's a good technique to be able to use. So I hope you enjoyed this little video tutorial on how to make bias binding. It really is a good skill to have. You can use it anytime you have to bind a curved edge, so that you just have that bias in the binding that gives you that little bit of additional stretch that you need. And I will have a video coming soon with how I make my patchwork pot holders, and I use the binding for those. But as I mentioned, curved quilts, scalloped borders, bags often require it. So it's just great to be able to make it on your own. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, and thanks so much for stopping by.